Welcome to the Ludonarrative Podcast. I'm Blake.
And I'm Preston.
And we're attempting to carve out an intellectual space in defense of video game ludonarratives. Ludonarrative simply is the intersection between gameplay and storytelling. And just about everything that is published on this idea of ludonarrative is framed in terms of ludonarrative dissonance.
Which is how gameplay fails in the narrative.
And so we would like to articulate a kind of defense through a series of examples, this week's episode being the first, where we examine what video games can do in terms of their storytelling capacity and what they do well. So, Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, by Starbreeze Studios and created by Joseph Fares, it's a beautiful and harrowing tale in many ways about death. And a lot of what Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons has to offer is framed from a position of loss and the literary trope of Bildungsroman, which is that coming of age kind of moment where we walk through the adolescence of characters. And so Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons is a really unique video game, if we're calling it that, because it's very much focused around controllers. And not many games spend time designing themselves around the physicality of controllers. So Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons has, as the name suggests, two brothers who on the right hand of the controller is the younger brother, on the left hand of the controller is the older brother, and you only have access to joysticks and trigger buttons for interaction. And so it's a conundrum to your brain because you don't necessarily have use of the D-pad, the directional pad, or the symbolic buttons of, let's say, a PS4 controller, the X and the square and the circle and the triangle, or move that into PC or into Xbox or however medium you want to describe it. But Brothers fundamentally presents this idea of what we have named our podcast after, which is ludonarrative. So ludonarrative, simply defined, is the intersection between gameplay mechanics and storytelling. And that is the whole premise for, I think, what a lot of these games that we're going to be talking about comes out of. It's this idea of what are video games doing specifically in terms of their ability to tell stories that's different, unique, and meaningful. And I think Brothers is one of those, which we'll get into, that puts a lot of faith in the ability of gameplay to tell a story.
When I sat down with one of my mentors, Maggie Carta, and I was speaking to her, like when this thought was nascent, video games as literature, when I was speaking to her about that idea, I made a slip up and said video games tell stories better than books. And Maggie said, I wouldn't think of it as they're doing something better. I would think of it as books are able to capture character development pretty well in description and character involvement in between each other. What video games are very good at is taking that bookness of creating character and looking at the nuances of character and simply peeling open this, the video game invites you to become the avatar. So, for example, when you're reading Grapes of Wrath and you're following the main character around, you are following the main character around. You're being led by the author. Video games do a similar thing, except they enshroud you into a world. And instead of suggesting that the main character is doing this, video games demand that you as the main character do this. And so the involvement bears down on the player itself to make the main character become alive. The main character will literally stand inert. It'll have the programmed features of moving and some life, but those are just side steps to create the all of those pieces that books allow for in character development. Video games take those structures that books are doing, and open up the world of character development, the world of character interaction, and force the player into the avatar seat. So instead of following someone through a book, you have this complete immersion into the character. So with Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, your interaction is divided. You have this feature of having two joysticks working both with and for the narrative, but also against the player. That there's this constant immersion in the game, that you are these two people and you're able to interact with all of the environmental pieces around you. Yet you have this constant awareness that one brother's going the wrong direction, the other brother is meandering all around, and so when you accidentally switch the brothers on the screen, one meanders over to the right side of the other brother, suddenly the controls are, the control pad has stayed normal, but the brothers now have reversed. And so then you have to think of the brother's on this side of the screen, so if I move the left one, I move him all the way on the right, but he should be on the left, and so you have this constant adjustment that pulls you out of the immersion. But I think that is, for me, it's a purposeful experience. It might detract from the gameplay, but I think that meandering that you're doing, the difficulty of controlling two brothers, I think that is a very important piece for what's occurring in the story. Because in the story, you have this constant, you don't have a compass rose. You don't have something pointing you towards something. You're following a path, and on the path you can always go your separate way from each other. The brothers can split up, and then they yell at each other.
What we want to achieve in this podcast is creating an environment to take video games more seriously in the way that we do with other cultural pillars like books, like film, like music. And I think another thing, kind of an elephant in this discussion, is there's a tension in many video games, if not most video games, between the player, the character, and this amorphous identity in between that you're negotiating through gameplay. And what Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons does uniquely, at least in terms of video games I've played, it not only interrupts that easy distinction between those kind of three sort of identities of player and character and that middle thing, but it divides your attention in two by needing to pay attention to the grammar of the game, to the way that one brother interacts with the world and the other brother interacts with the world, the older and the younger brother. I think that is what's at stake here, is for the first time in many video gamers' lives, they will have to think for two people at once. So Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons begins with death. The younger brother in the game witnesses, and the player witnesses as well, the mother of these two brothers drowning out at sea in this tempestuous climate. And that is the frame for beginning the gameplay. And so death is at the heart of almost all of the major plot developments in this. So at the very beginning of Brothers, you're introduced to how to interact between the brothers, and one of the first tasks that you have is to grab one side of a cart and get your other brother to grab the other side of the cart and wheel your dying, sick father to the kind of village...
infirmary.
Yeah, infirmary. It's like a healer. And one of the structures of this story is kind of archetypal in a way. The healer gives you a scroll, at the beginning and unfolds it and shows you, if you follow this path on the scroll, you will find the relevant medicine to save your father's life. And that's kind of what happens before any of the actual story unfolds itself.
When I first had divided the brothers up, grabbed both sides of the cart, what occurred in me is like I'm having to use two people to complete one task. This is not a completable task without two entities. And then as you're going through, you have to solve little puzzles at the very beginning to get your father over to the infirmary. Again, we have this, you have to have two people to complete these tasks. So then for me, after that thought was done, I started thinking, well, how are these two people different? If we're having to complete tasks, they have to be different people for different tasks, because some of the things the little brother can't do, some of the things the bigger brother can't do. And then there's a real delineation between the brothers in visuals, where the bigger brother is blue and the little brother's orange. And so for me, when I started making the brothers interact with the village folk, and then also the little puzzles that you figure out, I started noticing that the bigger brother had this cooler, more critical, more adult approach to the world. It was always, whenever you would interact with one of the village members, he'd pull up the map and then point to the map and do his little made up language, and then you would always have the villager point someplace.
I think one thing that I neglected to mention is that Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is a kind of story that's told without English language, at least for us. Not that that's unique to video gaming, but one of the more powerful elements of the story is that so much is communicated through body language alone. And so all of the gesturing that you're describing is how character development unfolds in this story. It's the difference in a lot of, well, story, like literary circles of show, don't tell.
So when the bigger brother would interact, it was this cooler, more adult demeanor. Whereas when the little brother would interact, there was this playfulness. He's orange, he's brighter, he's more involved. The village members would interact with him in a happier manner. They would be more enthused to see the little brother in the world and interacting with him, and they would laugh. And so their tasks are similar. The older brother, there's parts in the story where you can see the older brother almost without any words. You can see how the older brother, he's the one who would plan these things. So there's this one part where the younger brother goes into a cage to lure a big bad guy, and the older brother, you can kind of infer that he was the one who developed this idea, since he's the one commanding all of the controls. And continuously through the story, you see this again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the greatest strengths that video games have as a storytelling medium is the ability to demonstrate a relationship rather than account for it post hoc, kind of balancing and backfilling a lot of the details and how did we get here in terms of this relationship. And I think Brothers, I mean, just as the premise of dividing two characters into one control, it's like split screen within one screen. It's a wonderfully perplexing kind of premise of a game. So one of the first scenes in the game, the younger brother is by himself underneath this weeping willow sort of tree overlooking the ocean. And it's this afternoon sunset coming in behind a headstone. And the headstone we're led to infer by virtue of the little cutscene at the beginning of the game where the mother drowns. This headstone is representing her loss. So after the brothers get the scroll, again, this whole idea of the father being sick and dying. I mean, he's laid out on a wooden table, and the light is hitting this healer with white robes and white hair. He's a very wise-looking character. And again, there's no language here. So I mean, there's a language within the game, but it's not something that we have access to and are able to decode. And so the older brother adamantly gestures at his father to the healer, and he's dying is the vibe there. And so the healer gives him the scroll, and we're led to believe. I mean, have you looked at the scroll in detail?
The scroll has a tree and a circle around it, and then there's a line going straight down the middle, and then there's glyphs all around.
Yeah. What do you think that is trying to communicate as a detail in the game? Because clearly there's intention there.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a mythicness about the game. I mean, there's a mythical property when you finally get to this castle that's off in the distance that everybody seems to be motioning towards. Yeah. And then you ride on this griffin owl creature, and that's just throwing up. That is just throwing up mythic proportions all over the place.
One thing worth pointing out as well is much of Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. It mirrors the Brothers Grimm, and I wonder how explicit of a title reference that is. I haven't heard Joseph Ferris mention that, but the Brothers Grimm are notorious for their dark elements. It's cloaked in this childhood sort of fantasy fairy tale, and that's how Brothers feels. It's almost like a gimmick at first, and it's a nice Nordic village. And from the first cutscene all the way to the end of the game, where we'll get to with game mechanics, it's just brutal and depressing and hopeless and dark. And I mean those in all of the best possible ways. I mean, it's well executed.
As we describe more of this game, I think, and then especially having someone and having some of the listeners play the game, I think they'll begin to see that the game starts off in this child-go-lucky fun way. You have a bully in town who keeps you from going places, but you always find a way around him to get to where you're going. But as the game progresses, you encounter this extremely sad troll. You encounter this extremely sad troll, and he's disconnected. You don't understand why there's sadness. You just know that he's helpful. So as you go further, the game begins to get darker. You have more chances for the two brothers to die if you mess up on the dual controls. You start going down into darker areas. Trees begin coming alive, knocking you off of ledges. The process of Brothers, playing the game, as you move further through the narrative, takes on darker tones, and that's very purposeful because it has to lead towards covering the brothers in blood. It has to lead towards having this battlefield of dead giants where you sever limbs to get by, where you stand next to arrows going into eye sockets, brains and vultures brains flowing out of their skulls, vultures feeding on dead body parts. And you started in a town, a little village where you were trying to get away from a bully. So this progression is just it's a ever darkening process.
Early on in the game, the puzzles are pretty simple. Like we talked about, there's moving your dad around with his cart when he's sick and dying. But it gets to the point of individuated actions where the little brother can slip behind bars and reach certain parts of the map, and the older brother has each one of them are unique in what they're allowed to do by the rules of the game. And you mentioned the troll. I think that's worth talking about. Because we come up on the troll and he's weeping and he's sad and he's by himself, and then eventually you kind of, by proxy of interaction, you form a bond with him. And this kind of, pitiful troll, he leads you, at least this was my experience, he's helping you along your path to get to where the scroll is suggesting, that kind of map, like let's go to the top of the mountain and find the magical cure for your dad. Mm-hmm. But really what's going on is the troll is leading you in to find that his presumably wife or his female troll or whatever, that he's...
sister, whatever she is.
Yeah, but she is imprisoned. She is encaged. And that becomes an object of fixation. And by virtue of this troll helping you so far, you feel obligated, and it's not like you really have a choice, but to help. It creates, through nonverbal interaction with an unhuman creature, a kind of logical structure to like what you should do. It's like a moral.
So I think the troll has a lot of pieces that make up both its visuals, but also the implications for how it leads the brothers. So the troll never speaks to the brothers. It just kind of gets up, waves, and then assists. So when it's assisting, you get this notion that the troll is helping the brothers get to where they want to go, because there's the older brother again goes back to showing where they want to end up, and so the troll leads them along this path to get to that, ostensibly that place. Well, when you start actually paying attention to what the troll is doing, the troll is leading them to that cave where the wife is, or where the sister, the female troll is. And so at first, when you encounter the troll, you're like, wow, this friendly troll is helping you out. Well, maybe we shouldn't just assume friendliness onto it. There's a seeming underlying motive that the troll has, because you're clearly ending up at a cave and the troll got you there, and so it forces you that forces you, without realizing you're being forced, into saving that female troll. So I think that there are more perspectives in how to look at that troll than just as this is a good troll, because again, that troll speaks to that involvement in the humanness, that we're good, but even though I'm good, I might need someone to do something, and so I lead them in some way. I move them into thinking in this perspective. The troll does that as well.
There's a common critique in a lot of video gaming, and the easy example to pick fun at is Final Fantasy 13, also known as Final Hallway, where it's just this extremely linear, it's a hyper-linear experience where you can't deviate from the path that's laid out. And Brothers kind of functions that way, because there's really kind of only one thing to do in a lot of situations. But what Brothers does really well is it doesn't ever feel you're describing it as forced. It's like you don't have a choice but to save this female troll. But where does that feeling of I should help this female troll come from? And
where's the originator? Yeah.
I mean, it's just a beautiful example of how the video game Brothers is telling its story. It's showing it rather than telling it.
Right. There's a lot of implications locked up in how the brothers interact with all of the characters. There's the other doctor, and the doctor is, the doctor kind of functions as just a set piece to get you across to the castle. However, there's if the player was to explore more, the player would begin to see that the doctor has constructed this larger platform on the side of this mountain, and you can start turning this wheel with the older brother navigating these pipes back and forth, and it starts playing the theme of Brothers. And so what does this imply? There's a lot of, I honestly don't know how Ferris got the narrative into this way to get the player to feel these certain things about the troll, that, I just want to help it. But there are further implications behind what you're seeing on the screen. I mean, going back to the troll, as the troll helps, whenever the troll goes down into a ravine, you can see the troll's back bend, go down, become weighty, and so this goes back to how they found the troll, that there's this pressure that's constantly on the troll.
I think one of the more fascinating things about the relationship with the trolls and the brothers is there's kind of like when you approach the female troll who's imprisoned in that cage, there's a guard troll that you have to lure, distract, and eventually entrap in that same cage. And one of the ways that you get rid of this is I found this just brilliantly executed on behalf of brothers. The troll is holding on with each hand to a pit, and the brothers have to stand on his hands respectively to make him fall, and that's how you quote unquote beat him.
Right.
And I just as a storytelling mechanism, it's wonderfully visceral. It's that like you have to do the dirty work of let's say killing him or sinking him into that hole. And again, like it's wonderful how brothers can construct a kind of morality about it within the game on its own.
In silence. Like a morality, it's almost like a morality developed within silence.
Yeah.
And it's done by visual implication.
Yeah. Just entirely with it doesn't need language to facilitate it.
Right.
Which is just staggering
is.
To realize that video games can do that. We don't need a language in common. We just need these little avatars to anthropomorphize and project onto.
What do you think the false language does for the story, though?
Well, I wonder about that often because in many cases, my favorite games don't have explicit dialogue or language. And I think of, The Legend of Zelda or Shadow of the Colossus or Okami or Ico or all of those sort of examples where the story it's not contingent upon the specific mode of expression. It's always atmospherically told and suggested. I don't know why that grips me more, but I think maybe we'll get to this in a future episode.
Shadow of Colossus, because there's just lore galore.
Well, so Fumito Ueda, the guy who designed Shadow of the Colossus and Ico and The Last Guardian, and some of these games that generated our wanting to sit down and record this kind of podcast, he has this principle designed by subtraction. And we'll touch on that more fluidly in a future episode. But the idea is that less is more, storytelling wise. And so, this non-dialogue that's happening, it's so much more meaningful by virtue of interpretation. Sure, you could write dialogue, but that would cheapen the experience.
When Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons is telling a story, you have the main narrative. You can bypass all the townsfolk. You can bypass you can not pay attention to any of the mythical things going on, and you can still get the gist of what the story is doing. You'll still get to the end. You'll still get to make your choices. You'll still understand what's going on in the story. But if you were to involve yourself a little bit more and deal with the lore, so with Brothers, as you're going through the town, and I noticed this most vividly in the town, is that there's these moments where you can have the little brother and the big brother interact with the townsfolk. You'll see them rocking. You'll see the big brother, open his thing. But that's doing something for the story. It's exterior to the story. It's not important. It's kind of like oh, that's cute. I'm glad they added that. Like breakable things in any of the Gearbox games like Borderlands. Those are just additives that help you become more immersive. But I think those things, those little pieces of out of context storytelling really lend a lot of power back to the main narrative. Because then you don't just have the two brothers interacting like you don't just have, oh, I see that the big brother is the only one who can pull levers. I see the little brother is the only one who can turn gears. Now you can say, I see that the big brother can pull levers because he's making decisions. He's getting the little brother to do these other tasks because of these little pieces of lore and context that have gone into how he interacts with the townsfolk, with how he interacts with all of the little puzzles, with how he interacts with all of the other NPCs later on in the game. And the little brother, as you're going, you don't just say, oh, I can see the little brother can turn this gear lever or gear wheel. Instead, you can say, I can see this little brother turns the gear wheel because he's the one who executes everything. He's the main force that distracts the trolls, moves something, negotiates smaller areas, deals with the details of all of the plans that the bigger brother does. But that's provided by his playfulness, his ability to not have fear, his ability to push away the adultness that the big brother has, which keeps the big brother boxed into planning things, getting there, finishing this. And all of that is provided by these out of context lore pieces that help develop those characters. And I think video games are very powerful when it comes to using lore, outside influences, to help augment main narratives.
Brothers is the kind of game that rewards you in proportion to your engagement with the world. And so all of your points about lore, I think, are very helpful. There's a scene that sticks out in my mind where you can, as the older brother and the younger brother, interact with a harp. This
right.
Relatively early in the game, I think still in the village. And the little brother can play it masterfully, like just sits down and just makes music come out of it. And the older brother can't hold a tune for a finger. And little things like that. I mean, you're describing the kind of implied taking charge nature of the older brother. His brute leadership comes across like he can't be musically artistic. And those little details are absolutely fundamental. So you don't have to engage with any of those things. There's like the town drunkard that you can talk with. There's all these optional side questy sort of things that don't ever distract you from the story, or let's call it, again, to jokingly say, the hallway of the story. But it just intensely provides reward for curiosity. In a way. And so one of the interviews with Joseph Ferris that I've listened to, someone asked him, were there sections of this game that you cut out? Are there things that you wish could have been in this game that aren't? And he laughed and said, oh my gosh, a million things. What a decision they had to make in terms of like game over conditions is, brothers, you can't fall off the cliffs when you're jumping around. Like it's fail safe in a lot of ways because the ludonarrative, the intersection between gameplay and storytelling, is the heart of Brothers. It's the controller telling the story in a lot of ways, and your disorientation is it arises in response to the controllers, the puzzle of figuring out how to play it. And so Joseph Ferris in that interview said, I had to take a lot of these fail conditions out because the game is itself enough to make people quit. And I can say personally, when I first picked this game up in 2013, I played about 20 minutes of it, thought, oh, that's a cool gimmick, and never touched it again. It took a series of realizations and hearing people talk about this game to realize, oh, wow, if I just persist through the frustration, I'm going to have a yield of abundance.
It seems like when we speak about this game, we always go back to the controller. And I think when you say that the controller really helps tell the story, the controller and just the manipulation of the two brothers with the two joysticks, that has oodles of implication inside of it, where you have the two brothers, and they're difficult to navigate in the world, but that difficulty belies the inexperience of youth, the difficulty to get the two brothers on a straight path. Because I've not met anybody who said, "Wow, this is easy." I've only met people who say, "This reminds me of having to make decisions in the real world. Like, should I do this or should I do that? I need to get these decisions, or I need to get these things in line to go this way." But the two brothers don't ever get in line. And then once in a while you'll get them in unison and you walk easily, and life is good for the two brothers on their journey. But then you get to moments where you have to make turns and navigate smaller areas or mazes, and suddenly you're back to that confusion of navigating the brothers.
You touched on this briefly, but it's worth reiterating because anyone who's played this game will recognize what I mean. When the brothers cross on the screen and the logic, I mean, you're holding a left brother and a right brother in your hand, effectively, with one controller. When they switch, it just, for me, my brain doesn't know how to deal.
Disorienting.
Yeah, it's unlike any other video game that I've ever played to that extent. Because, one of the most comforting things to do in that game is to get the brothers back on track in proportion to left and right on the controller, left and right on the screen. And it's just wonderful and illustrative of how fragile human understanding and spatial intelligence is. That's one of those things that Brothers stands out as a game because of it's just fundamentally perplexing to play.
What do you think the controller? Why you've said a few times that the controller helps construct a story, help tell the story. Why are you saying that it helps tell the story?
I think one of the reasons is that the controller is so tactile, like your hands have a kind of intelligence. So video games, I think they take advantage of that tactile intelligence, let's call it. Yeah. That's one of the main reasons. And so what's the logical conclusion or the extreme of that in terms of implications? And it's like, well, we have things developing on the horizon like Oculus Rift and VR where controllers are actually shaped around your hand now, where they just attach as 5 fingers. And when you flex them, that is in some ways controlling your interaction with the game. I think that's exactly right. I think that's the future and one of the reasons why controls can tell a story very well. And I'm admittedly biased because there's an ignored distinction here between PC gamers and console gamers.
Right.
I don't think that a keyboard and a mouse are very good at telling a story. I think a joystick is very good.
There is something in a gamepad that is immediately story based. I don't know why, but it's natural for the hands to do. It's a very natural medium. Steam developed their own controller. It does very well. It has really good reviews. People enjoy it. It has all the capabilities of a keyboard and mouse, yet it's in the controller shape. Steam developed that controller for a reason. With keyboards and mice, you're on a level plane. Everything's on one level, and you interact with that one plane. With a controller, you have this multitude of planes, and your hands are able to form in a very natural way. Mice and keyboards are an unnatural storytelling device, it seems, because you're stretching to hit the Q, you're stretching to hit the F, you're stretching to hit the H and enter and space bar, and there's a load bearing on one of your hands while the other hand clicks. The other hand navigates the camera. Whereas with a game controller, it's almost fluid. It doesn't interrupt the story in any way. It doesn't break I need to hit the E. There we go, or anything like that. It allows you a closeness. The controller, everything's connected to each other. So hitting X, B, Y, triangle, whatever controller you're playing on, moving the joysticks, all of it is integral to helping tell a narrative because it doesn't disrupt you from having to think about it. It becomes a natural habit to do. When you're walking along the path, this is after the troll. This is after the trolls helped you. You've navigated the trees that are trying to knock you off the ledge. All of those little mythical entities have gone by the wayside, and now you're just back to traveling. You're back to managing the two brothers on either side of the controller and manipulating them in the world, trying to keep them aligned on the left versus the right so you don't get confused. So while you're doing all of this, you're going up a mountain. And there's like this little cove in the ridge that where this man is hanging himself, and you can see him like stand up on the chair, put it around his neck, get himself ready. He's making noises and grunting, and so my immediate reaction was just like, what's going on? And I started running over there because there's this again, that external narrative, that lore making device that's happening. So when you get over there, there's this old looking tree that doesn't have any leaves on it, and there's this tree house that is positioned up inside the branches of the tree, and there's this long, almost arm-like limb that is stretching out where the rope is tied, and the man has the rope around his neck, and he's standing on this wobbly stool. And so the older brother runs over the old man, or the man, and grabs him by the legs and pulls him up, because he's already knocked the stool over as you're running over to him. And the little brother climbs up, squirrels up the tree, runs over the branch, and starts untying the knot, and it takes time. It's not immediate. As soon as you get on the branch, the rope doesn't just collapse. It takes time, and you can see the man struggling. You can see the older brother struggling. You can see the little boy trying to hurry. And so then the rope falls, the older brother falls, the man who's trying to hang himself falls on the ground. And immediately when the man hits the ground, he starts crying. And so you're left with this roaring in the background. There's this roaring waterfall. And there's the man who is trying to hang himself. And so you have this roaring waterfall, this noise, this pounding noise in the background with just the whimpering of this man. And all he does when you try to interact with him, with the older brother, is point towards these ashes. And so you and the little brother can walk over to the ashes and stand, and you find out that this man his house is burned down. He has nothing left in the world. He wants to die. He's sad. He's alone. And so you can have the little brother and the bigger brother interact. And every scene where you have them interact with something that is sad or something that has been lost, both of the brothers, regardless of personality type, regardless of what characteristics they might have used in the past, they always hold their hands in front of them, bow their heads, and stand in silence, not moving, almost stoic like statues, in a grieving or condoling fashion. And then and to do that, you grip both the triggers. And once you let go, the brothers return to their normal and they move on. But that scene, after that scene, the world becomes darker.
It's as though that scene is the turning point for the second half of the game.
That's a dark thing to deal with, too.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about little boys, little kids.
A similar question to when we were talking about the trolls arises, which is, why do we care about this person? Like, how does this game motivate our moral reasoning such that we want to frantically and laboriously save this person?
Right.
That we've never met. We don't have yet the context of the burned down house. We don't know why this person wants to hang themselves and all of that. Like, again, it's the impetus to save someone else. Mm-hmm. We don't really have clear motivations for doing that.
Right.
But the game evokes that response in seemingly everyone. And it's not a real character. Mm-hmm. When I failed to save this person from killing themselves, I was distraught. Mm-hmm. And I also kind of poked fun at myself because of how bad I am at video games. But in all honesty, that was a traumatizing moment. And I was, preparing for this discussion, I watched a playthrough of the game and where the person was saved by the player. And I thought, my goodness, like, would that have shaped the tone differently for me if I had successfully saved this person?
Right.
Why did that, break me apart a little bit when I watched that happen?
We can ask where this intersection takes place, again, between why am I having this reaction about somebody that has no, like, first off, he's not, this character who's hanging himself is not important in the game. It's a side, it's a side piece of lore. It helps shape the world. I mean, that really, that's interactive lore that you're dealing with. You're not dealing with a side quest. It's interactive lore. It's simply filling in that this place, the town that you come from, where you had the bully, where you had the kiddishness, where you had to save your father. It was dark, but you're on this journey to save your dad. You have this hopefulness. It starts out in the town with this hopefulness. You will always get through. You'll always find a way. When you get to that, it reshapes the world. I think that's what that piece of lore does very well. And I think that might be why there's so much implication happening inside. There's so much, I need to save this person, because you've just come from this hopeful place, because this has rumblings of going back to your dad, that the entire journey is to save your dad, to save someone. So this person along the way, you're pulling into, the brothers are at least pulling into this idea that we need to also save him.
There's something about being around children that makes you want to be a better person. And any parent will attest to that, at least any parent that I've spoken to. And I think to myself, cloaking this story, and specifically this hanged man scenario, in the, ambitious and naive and hopeful kind of characterization of youth, that bright, sunny morning, as opposed to the shadowy afternoon, I think that as a premise makes you take for granted why you want to save the troll, why you want to save the hanged man, and so forth.
The glider part begins with life. There's a seeming energy that's in the scene when you first start gliding, because you bump into a scientist, you can create music from the wind, you can explore the scientist, speak with them, you can see the scientist dance to the music that you create from the wind. So there's life going on this side of the mountain. Then when you go to the glider, you move the brothers back and forth on this bar to turn the glider and all this stuff, simply navigating it. And then a flock of birds bursts through some of the wings, and the glider starts falling apart. And then when you get to the other side of the mountain, it is lifeless. And all you hear is this distant mewing noise coming from what seems to be this very large castle in the distance. And it's a lifeless place. It is falling apart, and there's seemingly no one else besides the brothers around.
You described the hanged man scene as kind of the turning point for the tone, and I would have disagreed and said that this glider, this flight, is the turning point, symbolically speaking. And as
it literally cuts you off from the back part of the game, because previously you could navigate all the way back to the almost all the way back to the village.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas with the glider, you're done.
It's no return, and from here on in the story, we get introduced to some really dark things.
So what if when we're talking about these lore components and then these divisions in the narrative, what if lore components help make delineations in this is how the tone will change?
Yeah.
Whereas with the glider, then sets a new setting that it can do tone, but it demands a new setting, that the setting is going to change to match the tone that was set by the lore piece.
Absolutely. The lighting of the game, the music of the game, the physicality of your environment, all of that changes through this before and after with the glider scene. When I was playing it, the affect component came out to me there, because it's the point of no return. You can't fly back with your broken glider.
Right.
It feels we have to learn adolescence really quickly.
Yeah.
There's no time for dallying about. So after this glider scene, I'm going to appeal to Mike Mahardy's 2013 article in Polygon, where he sat down and talked with Joseph Fares, the designer of this game. Mahardy writes of a Lebanese refugee named Joseph Fares, whose trauma led him to creative expression through film and later video games. Ferris fled Lebanon in 1987, about 10 years old, during a bloody religious civil war in which Ferris was exposed to carnage, catastrophe, and evil each day. Even under these conditions, 10-year-old Ferris was unable to leave due to economic pressures, and he says, "Artillery shells fall in populated areas, dividing the days into segments of terror and boredom, hiding and waiting. As the war drags on, the justice system degrades, resulting in widespread crime that makes Lebanon one of the world's largest narcotics producers. It's not an ideal place, by any means, especially not for a child." But 10-year-old Ferris can't leave. He doesn't have a choice. Leaving the country is expensive, and the process of attaining the proper paperwork is only short for those with the money to speed it up. He says, "The war was," and Ferris hesitates here, and you get the sense that it's not just from a lack of words. "I experienced a lot of things a child should not." The bare simplicity of Ferris's words is almost more powerful than any charged description might offer. And thankfully, Ferris's family was able to flee to Sweden after 4 rejections from the Lebanese government. Ferris comments on the uniqueness of Brothers and says, "Essentially, I wanted to tell a story about relationships, but oddly enough, it had to be played alone. And that's what's at stake in this game with its controllers." The fact that Joseph disregarded some of the most classic and principled design rules of video gaming, it made some people nervous to even fund and invest in a game like this. But as you can see by virtue of this conversation and others, my goodness, what a success. That every time I read that, it just moves me, man.
I think an interesting part of that interview is realizing that Brothers is about a relationship, but you play it alone. And that's such a strange realization in a game where the focus is playing alone, yet playing out a relationship between two brothers. I think the relationship really comes into relief when after the glider, you have to have both brothers to ascend the castle, because you begin climbing up these rock faces, and the older brother at the bottom, before the initial climb, ties a rope onto himself and then hands the other side to the little brother, and so now they're bound by a rope, and the relationship is becoming so visceral. It's available visually in a rope. And then when you get to a point, you start one brother. So the controls, you have to hold both of them down to maintain a grip. But then you have to let go of one control, and the brother will swing down, then pull the trigger again. Brother grabs on the next one, and then you do almost this waveform along the bottom of the castle to navigate the brothers along the walls. And so there's this relationship where if one of the brothers lets go while you're doing this swing up to the next, they both die. There's no safety. The safety is only in understanding the controls, understanding the brothers on what they're going to do, knowing which side to let go of, which side to hold on to.
Yeah, I mean, the rope is trust embodied. It's
right.
Putting faith in the ability of the other brother to cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I can't say that is present in many or most other games. It's always, with video games, singular identity.
Mm-hmm.
And to have to be both and do both and account for both and in some ways do the emotional labor of that relationship between
right.
one half and the other half of the controller. It's just unique to Brothers. And not to get too ahead of ourselves, but with Joseph Ferris's new game, A Way Out,
mm-hmm.
It's a forced split-screen experience between two characters. And I'd be really interested to see how those play out in terms of the implications of game design and ludonarrative. After this glider scene and so forth, we encounter a war-torn battlefield with all of these giants that are just slaughtered and bloody and dead. And the reason that I interjected the interview from Ferris is because you can really see how the childhood trauma manifests itself. One question is why they're giants to begin with, because you're coming from a village of people that are, of the same size as you. Mm-hmm. And in the world, there's the design grammar where it feels like the brothers are at home in the landscape. There's pathways, there's homes, there's
earth tones the brothers are wearing, and then
and all of a sudden we have this very hyper industrialized, they're wearing armor, they have spears and halberds and maces, and you have to go through this landscape of slaughter,
all the while following a river filled with blood.
Yeah. Talk about taking a dark turn. This game goes Brothers Grimm very quickly.
Yep. When you first encounter this, the music changes and the setting changes. It's barren, dry, desert-like with a river. The river first starts out crystal blue, and then as you get closer and closer to the giants, it begins running with streaks of red until it just becomes red. And all the while, as you're moving further and further into this war zone, or at least a post-war zone, you hear rocks clattering in the background, and there's this ever-present flap of wings from vultures landing on carcasses, and then then there's the ever-present gnawing of beaks on flesh. And you startle vultures, they flap away, spreading blood all over the place and leaving wounds in the arms and legs of these giants. Weapons. So the bodies are very apparent, but the weapons are the things that glint and gleam the most. It's almost calling attention to this mayhem and destruction that these weapons embody. And so you begin to realize that you're going to have to interact with some of these weapons. The way you interact, the things you have to do to get further down the river, either pulling massive crossbows bolts back and shooting them into heads and eyeballs of giants to knock them over ledges and watching them fall all the way down with massive booms clearing the way, or using an arrow that's lodged in the elbow of one giant to push the giant's arm out of the way, or using an axe that's precariously leaning against a canyon wall and push it over and plop it down onto, cleave a giant's arm off to clear the way for the river again. These things are choices the brothers are making. These things are choices the player is making, utilizing again that divided control system to get the brothers to work together. That you're realizing that their relationship is having to go through some sense of turmoil. What is this what is the relationship? What is the relationship toll on the brothers? What is this doing to the little brother that the bigger brother is having to command? Again, without vocals, without the player necessarily knowing the command is happening, but that command, the notion of a command is still there. What is that taking the two brothers to? To what extent are these interactions with the dead bodies and cleaving them and moving them and having to navigate a torn field? What extent is that experience taking the brothers to?
One way to think about that is in terms of how does the design grammar of the world elicit your response, and you can figure out the logic to progress, and it's not immediately obvious in some of these instances with these giants that are dead, that their bodies are the puzzle. Not to be too obvious, but it seems like the presence of these giants is to suggest something bigger than the brothers.
Right. I think also when you finally exit, the brothers don't come out clean. That's a huge component of this war field. That as you go through, you become dirtier and dirtier until you leave the war zone, and you do not come out clean. You are covered in blood. And this again belies that. What has it done to the brothers' relationship? What has it done to the brothers' image? What has it done to their morals? How is it reshaped? And so what story is Ferris having to pull out of himself to make that happen? Because that's not just something that's added in there as a nice gimmick or a nice narrative piece. That's something that is drastically pointing towards a moment of hurt, where Ferris is almost commenting back on himself, saying, I didn't come out clean.
Yeah, so we should probably move into what you're kind of implying, which is this inevitable scene in the game where the brothers approach what looks like a tribe, and they're sacrificing, let's say, this archetypal virgin woman figure up at this altar. And in between all of these tribal members, they're performing their ritual, there's these rivers of blood coming through the stone architecture. And at the base of these rivers, there is a kind of drawing or blood-smeared image, like a cave painting almost, of, presumably their god or their deity that they're sacrificing this young woman to. And again, this game is powerful in it makes you want to care about and help the non-playable characters, like the troll, like the hanged man, and in this case, like the woman. And I think what's brilliant about this game is that both the troll and the hanged man, they're genuine things that you feel better about on the other end of helping.
Right.
With this woman, it's not so clean cut. It's a little more caveated with what happens after this. It's her movements that, again, motion towards that sense of lore that are outside the main narrative, but tell you and point towards a character that you can't see in her yet. Yeah. Well, you see her and you want to save her because there's all this blood, and you just got through this battlefield, and they're sacrificing her, presumably unfairly. And there's also this budding romantic interest that develops with the older brother, and it kind of becomes a wedge. Yeah, exactly. So I almost am disappointed in Brothers to the extent that this woman becomes what she becomes, and we'll get there. But I think it's a great setup, because what's just beautiful about the game mechanic is we see at the end of this river of blood, this image, this cave painting of their god, and it's the younger brother standing on the older brother's shoulders. I mean, and that gives them a clue to do that, and they bathe themselves in blood.
They choose to, again, dirty themselves. And that speaks back to coming from a war zone, that because you've come from a war zone, you don't exit clean. So does that make the choices you had to make in a war zone easier to make when you have to choose to dirty yourself again?
Well, not to get terribly off on a tangent, but Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust inside of the concentration camps, and one of the points he makes in that book is the best of us didn't make it out alive. We had to compromise our morals to survive. We had to throw people under the bus unnecessarily, and there's no nobility in that. There is just a striving for order and safety and flourishing, whatever that eventually takes the form of. And so, I think that's a very literal translation of that kind of point. Joseph Ferris had to, survive.
Right.
And I don't know what he did. I don't know what he had to do, and I can't even begin to imagine growing up in a war zone. But one of the interviews I was listening to, he was commonly just in a basement as a kid drawing, and because there was nothing to do other than just wait it out.
Right.
And that's horrible. So the brothers, they bathe themselves in blood, and the younger brother stands on the older brother's shoulders, and they go and spook this tribe. They're like, my goodness, my deity is just incarnated, interrupting this sacrifice and ritual. That must be a cataclysmic experience for their spirituality. And then you end up saving this young woman. And that kind of begins, let's call it the final arc of the game. Is there more to say there?
The lady, the young woman that you save is clearly taller than both brothers. She's lankier, thinner. She moves way too lithely. each movement she makes, she almost skitters like a spider. And that is conveying something. That's making you stop. Like, no other human, no other entity we've come across in this story so far has moved anything like that. And so that is again pointing towards that hidden change in what might occur in the main narrative. That lore-based thing that isn't connected to the main story, but helps change maybe the tone or mood for that new setting you're moving into. I think one of the things I've noticed is that if I can go back a little bit with the troll, with the owl griffin that you fly on after the scientist, even the scientist himself, and then this new lady, each character becomes a set piece for where you can't go back any longer. That relationship you created was finalized, and you move forward. It helped you. It progressed you further through the story. And that's a theme in the story that I don't think I realized until just right now.
No, I think you literally, like, as you said that, I had a realization, which is the glider scene. Every scene is you're growing up. You're moving through adolescence. You can't go back to the innocence of youth.
Right.
And at a point, as the river goes from crystal blue to blood red, I mean, that is the mark of maturity, however dark.
Also, if you look at how the brothers are interacting with these characters, these character scenes, the first one is the troll, and they're being assisted by the troll. Like, they're not actually having to do anything other than being thrown, tossed, and then literally a bridge. And then as you progress further, the brothers become the person who's having to be the bridge for themselves to figure out all these pieces. And that plays directly into your point of you're having to grow up. That there's no longer the safety of adulthood to help you out from above. You're the adult now, and you're going to have to be your own safety. The choice to become dirtied by blood is where that demarcation for I am now adult comes from.
So once this young woman enters our company with the two brothers, she kind of becomes integral to the story, and like I suggested, a bit of a wedge between their relationship. Mm-hmm. But also the physical setting changes. We now enter ice world.
Yeah.
And I love that that's an archetype in a lot of video games. There's always like the ice level and all that sort of thing. But in this game, it very much plays symbolically to the strengths of an ice world construction, where we have this invisible monster, for lack of better description, that you only are aware, sort of, that it's there by virtue of its paw prints.
Right.
Snow has to convey that. It's specifically the environment that is the set piece for the plot.
Right.
I don't know if you want to move through some descriptions of that too, but that might be helpful.
I've replayed that game a few times, and I'm still confounded by those series of scenes. I don't get the monster. I don't, because there's this interplay between the brother and the young woman you saved, because at this point you're moving with her through the story, and you get into this town where everyone's frozen and covered in snow, and there's this invisible, massive, like Bigfoot walking around, but you have no clue what it ever looks like. You never find out. It dies before you can see it, or it supposedly dies. So I don't understand the interplay between that, because you're working with the young female, with the older brother and the younger brother together to save, but the younger brother becomes this kind of like third wheel. Like you just have to keep him up with the older brother and the young girl. The young girl becomes this person the older brother follows. And I think one of the things that becomes very apparent is that when you're playing, you are the older brother. Like, there's not this, the younger brother you move to get stuff done. At least for me, there was this, you're not both. And that only becomes very apparent in that scene, at least for me.
Well, you've described consistently throughout this conversation the older brother as having agency and control and being the commander of what happens. It's interesting that you're willing to go out on that limb because the story is first framed in its cutscene with the younger brother.
Right.
The younger brother loses the mom, and we
Right.
see the younger brother kneeling at the grave, weeping at the very beginning of the game. But to your point, I think that's exactly right. The older brother is, by virtue of his command, the main character, and then to see this young woman that you saved start to lead, and I think, about the monster, I don't really get the monster either. Why is it invisible? Why is it plaguing this village? What purpose does that serve towards the solution for the cure for their father?
Right.
I don't have good answers on those, but maybe one answer is, she has to lead by example of how to evade this monster and how to survive it. There's these like snowmen characters that you have to mimic their poses and hide behind, and she is the first one who kind of executes on that survival strategy.
Right.
So I don't really know how to place that invisible monster other than just another game mechanic puzzle that's between you and your conclusion.
I mean, we could extrapolate for the invisible monster. Like you take up, you play different characters in life. You mimic other people to stay alive. Whatever you need to do to fill in. Because again, we're talking about this within the context of somebody who has come from a war zone, somebody who has grown up in what shambles, like a real third world place that is dangerous daily. So for us to understand that, I think the monster, the invisible monster is getting at something. But as of right now, I think I'm not going to touch it, and I'm going to move on. Again, this game is, like you said at the beginning, a hallway. But it never actually feels like a hallway. That you're always going towards a new character who's going to change the setting, change the mood, and change the tone. Always does that. That's kind of the theme of this game, it seems. And so, saving the girl happens after you cover yourself in blood. Then you choose to after you're covered in blood, then you choose to cover yourself in blood to save the girl. Then you move into an ice world. And so the entire setting changes. The coldness maybe potentially represents some of the wedge that comes between the younger and older brother for how the girl interacts. There's a scene where the girl and the older brother embrace, and the younger brother, throws a little bit of a fit, but in the foreground of the scene, while the older brother and the girl are in the background. Moving towards the monster ensues. The girl helps navigate what you begin to realize the older brother through the world. There's not like a lot of interaction between the younger brother and the older brother. It's just the older brother and the girl, and so the younger brother becomes this byproduct, this extra product that you have to move on the screen. Then at the end of this, after the bridge, after the monster falls, that's where the embrace between the older brother and girl happens, and then you move up a mountain again, and it becomes snowy. You go across you go across a frozen lake where you have these narwhal / killer whale creatures who do this wonderful song and jump up and could potentially destroy your boat, and you have to mitigate all of those monsters jumping up out of the water, and then you get finally to where the girl reveals herself.
And she reveals herself as a spider.
Right.
And, you could take a very feminist lens and apply it to what that signifies in terms of potential misogyny and the web of femininity that catches the flies of masculinity and so forth. But the older brother, he's romantically interested in this young woman. She's attractive, as you described. She moves lithely, and then she reveals herself as a spider. And there's this, for a lack of a better term, a boss fight at the end where you have to dismember her. You have to rip her arms and legs off.
Mm-hmm. If you have the older brother having feelings for this girl, and one thing this game does well, if you have those feelings for the older brother and the girl, one of the things the game does very well is it sets up and maintains feelings about certain characters. And you can remember those feelings. So the troll, the scientist, the owl griffin, the war zone, which is in a sense a character in itself, and this girl, the game is going to most likely make the older brother have trouble dismembering this girl, have trouble with trying to match this girl that, you know, the younger brother and the older brother saved to this now spider creature that's trying to eat both of them. And so I didn't pay attention to, well, does the older brother pause and you can only move the younger brother at first? I mean, we could turn the game on and see, but...
I mean, the ending of this game is bizarrely intricate. There are so many disparate elements. And retrospectively, you realize that when you save this woman from this tribe, it's like, oh, they were probably sacrificing her for a good reason. Like, they knew she was a spider, whatever implications that has. And that's another part of growing up, is naively believing in a moral cause and realizing on the other side of your actions that you've messed up, that you've made the world worse in aggregate, even though the whole time you thought you were doing the right thing. And that's another bridge that can't be recrossed. It's burnt as soon as it's crossed.
The scene with a young lady who was rescued by the two brothers. After she transitions into a spider, she captures them in this orb, this woven orb silk, whatever this silk.
A web.
A web, thank you. Into a web orb. And so the two brothers then move back and forth until the thread connecting it back to her spinneret breaks, and they drop and the orb breaks. Yet the young brother remains in the orb. The older brother, the spider drops down on top of him, traps him. And so the younger brother is the one who makes the first move and knocks the spider away, flipping her over onto her back, and she reveals one of her legs. And then, at that point, the older brother has to go up and remove one of the legs. And so it is always the younger brother who initiates the go do this, go do that. Now, there's a switch where the younger brother is the one knocking the spider over, the older brother is the one who's removing the leg.
Here's where it gets, well, not that it hasn't been dark before, but here's where the darkness truly manifests. So you end up succeeding, presumably, in defeating this Spider Girl character, and she dies, but she takes the older brother out with her, stabbing him in the chest. And so after defeating the Spider Girl, this griffin owl-like character that's extremely cute, dare I say, kind of offers, it lends you a wing, and you return to safety, kind of archetypally arriving at the place where the quest of brothers began. You're back at the tree, the willow tree overlooking the sea. And the older brother, now ravaged with the poison coursing through his veins from the spider stab, he finally dies in the younger brother's arms. And here I'm going to return to the interview with Mike Mahardy and Joseph Ferris from 2013. He says, late in the game, you're asked to do something morbid, to bury a character with the unique controls the game provides. For those desensitized by the fantasy backdrop of brothers, it's a startling, macabre moment. For Ferris, it's a memory. Growing up, he had always wanted a younger brother. Ferris's older brother had been a close childhood friend, had taught him everything he knew, and Ferris wanted to pass it on. So he was excited when his mother finally went into labor, but she lost the baby during birth. It was a boy. Knowing Ferris's wishes, his mother gave the baby to him to bury. And he says, "I buried a newborn little brother when I was young, quite young myself. It was me and my sister. It wasn't a proper burial. It was something we just found. I mean, those days in Lebanon, with the war, there wasn't any working society, any infrastructure. We had to improvise." And so these dark and dysphoric moments in Brothers are capitalized on its ludonarrative. So the premise of the game, dividing each character up on one half of the controller from the other, the older brother and the younger brother on the left and the right, you're faced with a scene where you still have to play the story, but half of you is missing. The older brother is absent from the controller. And with the logic of Brothers, where the trigger buttons and the joystick, you have to lower the brother into the grave and cover him up with dirt.
That scene is agonizingly slow.
Yes.
The backdrop, I think, is important. The backdrop is beauty. You've just come out of a desolate ice wasteland. The younger brother has carried the older brother down, blood dripping from the older brother's chest, and then you leave him at the bottom of the tree. The older brother demands the younger brother go up. And so the younger brother ascends the tree, comes back down, and finds the older brother dead. And so dragging the older brother in front of this gorgeous tree, this tree, by the way, is a willow. It mimes the beginning of the story. Except this willow is massive, and you can ascend it, and you weave through the branches until you get to this glowing blue receptacle in the middle of this tree's heart. And so while you're digging this grave for your older brother, you continuously have this wonderful white leaf willow in the background with white leaf bushes around you. And there's this glorious pink gold setting in the background behind the tree as well. And so everything should be beautiful. Everything should have been wonderful because you were supposed to ascend the tree with your brother. You were supposed to get this for your father with your brother. You were supposed to get all the way back to your father. And that's not going to happen. And so there's this feeling of I don't even know. Like these things shouldn't have happened. I should be doing this. I should be walking back with my brother.
Well, it's an account of trauma. Like the whole game, you are participating in the ongoing traumatic splits within the consciousness of this younger brother, specifically the younger brother. And by the end of that story, I mean, it kind of like Joseph Ferris's childhood account, it just, words could never suffice. It's too affecting.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'm now aware that we skipped over is the dream sequence, right? Where this
right
with the mom.
With the mom, yeah.
What the hell is that?
I don't know. I mean, is that from the older brother or the younger brother? Because it seems like it's from the older brother. Or wait, it seems like it's from the younger brother because the older brother shakes the younger brother to wake up. The older brother doesn't seem to really interact with the mom. The younger brother is the one who's envisioning these dream quest things. I don't know. Maybe what this game does really well is it lies to you about who the main character is. a lot of that, I think, would be a comment back on me talking about the older brother demands and commands a lot of the interaction in the world. Pulls the lever, directs the younger brother. Whenever you pull the trigger, when there isn't a grab feature or a lever around, the older brother says, "Hey!" and yells at him in the made-up language to come, or at least seemingly to come along, to move forward. And so, through all of the seeming narrative that's set up, the older brother is the one who's in command. Yet the story seems to be about the younger brother.
An interesting kind of series of I like the way you describe it. The game lies to you very well. And it lies about who the main character is. And so you begin the game with a cutscene where the younger brother and the mom, there's that traumatic divide. And then you come together at the beginning of the actual gameplay with the older brother to save. There's a productive quest where you think, if we only get this medicine or ascend this mountain or whatever, we will save our father. Right. Good. We're going to prevent the next loss of life. But through that quest, we don't actually get much of a guarantee of that until the very, very end of the game. And through that process, we have all of those just open wound experiences of, for instance, burying your own brother. Mm-hmm. By the end of the game, the father is alive, but that's not a bright, happy ending. It's it's the shadow of the journey that they just went on. Mm-hmm. One thing that struck me is the way the game ends as it parallels with its beginning. In the beginning, we have the younger brother weeping on his knees in front of a tombstone underneath this willow tree. By the end of the game, we have 2 headstones. And that second tombstone is a testament to all of the work that you just put into that story. And it's hard as a player not to feel implicated in that brother's death and feel, wow, if I had just gone back and done things differently, he would still be here. And that's a powerful feeling to walk away from a game with. Early on in Brothers, we have a sense that because the mom drowned in the beginning, that the younger brother is hydrophobic. He is terrified of being in water. And early on in the game, the older brother has to kind of piggyback the younger brother through the water. And we get a sense, and it's a way of communicating their bond as showing, not telling, like we've said. The older brother is able to work through this, and the younger brother just has to kind of dangle on to the arm. But by the end of the game, the younger brother has to swim by himself.
There's a lot in this game. When you swim as the younger brother at the very end, the controls are different than swimming when you're with the older brother. With the younger brother, in the beginning parts of the game, you pull your trigger and hold on to the back of your brother, and then your brother can just go in the water and swim. You don't have to hold the control. You just push him forward, and he goes. When you get to this last scene where the younger brother is ascending to the house, and then meets the ghost of his mother and falls down on the beach because now he has to swim. He cries, and the mother helps him up because he can't do it. He's not going to be able to get back to the house. And so you have this very large area of sand where you are after you've climbed down from this cliff. And you can move all around in this area, but there's no way to get back up the cliff or escape from having to swim. The game leads you into this, there's this path back here, and it becomes a path, but it just ends. And then you're stuck, and you have to trace your steps back. When you get back to the beach, the controls for the little brother to swim is to pull that trigger, which is a mime all the way back to grabbing onto the back of your brother. And when you pull that trigger, the little brother gets into the water and starts swimming. And that, I've got goosebumps right now. That in itself is that it makes you aware that you no longer have the left side of your controller. You only have the right.
I thought of an interesting way to describe the brother's palpable absence on that one half of the controller. So Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, has this idea of nothingness, where you look for your friend in a cafe space and they're not there, but their absence is a kind of presence in and of itself. And when you lose that half of the controller, the interface that you have with the story and the world, and more importantly, the relationship between the brothers, it's Sartre's nothingness. It's an obvious absence. And that's a weird thing to formulate, but it's integral to video games as a storytelling medium. I don't think that that's the kind of thing that could be produced through a book or through a film. And when we talk about video games and try and justify taking them seriously as adults, it's one of those things where I can point to Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, and say, show me an example better than this. I struggle to think of one.
Yeah. The end sequence where you're making your way back to your father, the game intelligently throws all the obstacles that require your older brother in front of you. A lever to move, an elevator. You watch the younger brother grab at the same place, struggle, let go of the control. Character walks around, go back, struggle, and then you pull it down. When you have the older brother hunched down below a ladder to toss the little brother up to grab the ladder, now you have the little brother squatting far away, running up the wall to grab the ladder all by himself. There's all these features that would require the older brother, that absence is so glaringly obvious in these moments. You don't have the blue-clad image of your brother squatting in front of the wall helping you up. Now you just have a bare wall that you're having to ascend. It's like having a tough reality just sitting in front of you. You don't have a choice. Yeah. It's a demand of adulthood that you are now not your younger brother. You're now both your older and younger self combined.
I think one of the more profound things about Brothers is that it's the kind of game that you need to sit down and play in an afternoon. It's not the kind of game that you stretch out over weeks and days. It could be knocked out in 2 hours if you really just play the hallway version, or if you engage with the world very directly, then it could take you something to the effect of 4 hours. But this story that we've just talked about it traverses that entire scope within such a sliver of time, and it leaves me speechless as to the depth that video games as a storytelling medium have.
I think to wrap all the way back at the beginning, again, if books are very able to create a narrative for characters to develop in, video games are very good at looking at what books are attempting to do and just personifying that in visual, lore, auditory, and the multitude of other mediums that video games ensconce in themselves. So video games make demands of the player to really pay attention to character creation, to really pay attention to when I do these moves, tone is being adjusted. When I do these moves, I am noticing theme. When I do these moves, I'm noticing motif and juxtaposition. What do these things tell and help shape about the world I'm in? And one thing that I don't think books have captured is lore. Video games can entice more from a narrative from lore. I think that's really the strength that video games have over the medium of books.
If you'd like to continue these conversations, you can find us at Ludonarrative Podcast on all the relevant social media, except for Twitter, which is Ludonarrative FM. If you'd like to support this content, check out patreon.com/epilogue gaming. Epilogue Gaming is our host site that was the impetus for this podcast. If you'd like to become a silver tier contributor to Patreon for $1 a month, you can ask a question that we will address at the end of these episodes. This week's question comes from a Patreon subscriber that asks, why are we approaching ludonarrative in terms of literature? Because the obvious analogy or metaphor would be film. Why are we framing it in this way, Preston?
So when I'm thinking, I would answer this question in, I think, a series of different ways. First off, when we're approaching film, we're using many of the same tools that we developed from literature and books to look at film. So when we talk about mood and setting and tone and juxtaposition, theme, motif, all of those things help define what film is doing as well. You can't remove mood from film. Those things are integral to it. There's the setting the character is moving in, but the setting itself has its own mood. The character has its own tone. The setting has its own tone. So there's all these interacting pieces that are taking place in this three-dimensional world that you're watching through a box. So yeah, of course I could interact with video games similar to film, but then this also connects back to books as well, because films are connected to books. Those same tools they're interchangeable at this point. And so what I think really matters here, and how I think I would define or redefine this question a little bit, is that why are we choosing literature to define this? I think it's more of we're adjusting how we perceive these things. So with books, you're following a narration. You're not interacting with the narration. With film, you are participating in a viewing of a narration. With video games, you're interacting and changing the narrative. And so that's why I think I choose to look at literature in that way. I choose to look at video games in that way, because we don't have tools yet to define what video games are doing. We're having to make up new ideas and perspectives to help define how video games are creating these narrative twists and these narrative themes. And that's how I would look at it, as more of a perspective of participation, following, and interactivity.
I think one of the main reasons that I've framed this discussion and this podcast about ludonarrative in terms of literature is because, A, that's my domain of expertise. Also, video games aren't taken seriously. They're treated as something you grow out of, and we'll get into this in future episodes, but I got tired of justifying myself every time I said, I'm going to play video games. It looks and seems and sometimes feels like a frivolous activity, a waste of time, something that you're doing in your downtime. And we don't treat books that way. We don't really treat films that way.
We view them as academic pieces.
Yeah, they're cultural pillars. And I believe that video games are as important as a cultural pillar, because things like Brothers just can't be experienced apart from those metaphors, apart from what storytelling means to culture and relationships and identity.
You don't want to participate in Brothers. You want to interact with Brothers. Participation in Brothers would denude the player of emotions.
If you'd like your questions answered on next time's podcast, become a monthly patron at patreon.com/epiloguegaming. Your support is what has made this podcast possible. And in the meantime, head over to epiloguegaming.com for more explorations of video games as a medium for art, literature, and a storytelling medium. Music for this episode has been provided by Gustav Grefberg, recorded and edited by Blake Guthrie. We'll see you next month. Thank you for listening to the Ludonarrative Podcast.